All right, is it time to put the cuffs and plackets on your new shirt? Well, let's do it. I have a shirt sleeve with the bias placket and straight up cuff. I'll be using the Archer button up by Grainline Studio as my example, and I have some tips and tricks on using that particular pattern. But this style shirt sleeve placket will go on any shirt sleeve placket. Men's, women's, children, it doesn't matter. It's a very simple, basic way to do it, and it's really not that hard. And I have some really nice little tips to get you on your way. If you like what you see, please comment and subscribe and like, and happy sewing. Good luck. Okay, I'm going to be starting with the bias style placket, and I'll be using the Archer button up by Grainline Studio. And I have some kind of crazy fabrics here just so you can see the difference between things and also see the right and the wrong side. I have my bias placket here cut on the bias fabric. That's why it's called bias, so it has a lot of stretch. This is definitely a pretty easy sleeve placket to sew, and it always looks great. So don't feel like you have to do the column style to have a nice looking shirt. So with this Archer button up, the one thing I noticed with my pattern pieces, and maybe the pattern has been updated because I've had my pattern a really long time, is the cuff is always way too long for the pattern. And I kept thinking that maybe I was cutting it out wrong, but I don't think so. I think that there's just some weird little mishap with that, and it's probably been fixed by now. So if you're seeing that as well, you're not missing a thing. I think that there's something up. So I'm going to walk you through that as well. So right here I have the left sleeve here, and I know that because this larger section between the slit and the underarm is the front, and the front always buttons toward the back away from your front. So we have this lower sleeve here, and then there's some notches for some pleats. We have one cuff, and I have interfaced half of it. You can interface the whole thing if your fabric's lightweight enough, but just make sure that if you do interface only half, that you get a really nice straight line there, and you get it all fused on there unless you're using non-fusible. All right, so let's get to it. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to attach the bias to the placket here. And what I like to do is do this usually when I do binding, and if you've ever sewn with me, you know I sew a lot of binding. I always love sewing with the binding on the top, but this is a little different because we're actually going to be sewing kind of a stitch line in the shape of like what a dart looks like when it's on paper. So we're going to come up from here about 1/4 inch away from this cut edge, and we're going to go to the top of this slit to nothing there, and then back out to 1/4 inch there. And what I like to do is do this so that I am looking at it from the sleeve side. So we're going to put the placket right side to wrong side. We're going to line up these raw edges here, and we're essentially going to sew this in a straight line. So let's see here. We're going to start at the hem of the sleeve opening. And now here is that top of the slit, and I'm going to pull this. I'm not going to pull really hard, but basically I'm just going to straighten it out. And we're going to pull this over so that we have a nice straight 1/4 inch line that's parallel to the bias placket and just goes to 0 at that slit. So go up here. And you don't have to hold it in a straight line the whole time. You can go like this. Just make sure you keep this top of the slit 1/4 inch away from that edge. And now I'm going to lift my presser foot up. I'm not really pivoting. I'm pivoting the fabric, not I'm pivoting the sleeve, not the binding. And then we'll continue on. So I sewed in a straight line, but the sleeve doesn't know it. All right, so there we go. And you have this little bit of a rumple there. All right, and now we're going to iron this. And the reason I start on the back side is so that when we finish our binding, it always looks good on the right side. All right, so let's iron this. All right, so we're going to iron this from this side first, and we're just going to press it all one direction. Really, we're just trying to set ourselves up for this next step to be a lot easier. Don't worry about this little rumpled area quite yet. All right, and if you like, You can continue to iron your binding, folding it under and lining up that fold edge to that stitch line, just like that. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do it on the fly, but if that makes you feel better, you're welcome to, fold under this long edge here. Even if you just do that at the very minimum, iron on up this long edge, your next step will be even easier. All right, so we're ready to go. Okay, and so now we're going to pull our binding to the right side of the sleeve, turn it under, and that fold right there should go just past that stitch line that we just sewed. All right, and we're going to stitch right along the edge there. No need to back tack. It's going to get caught in the cuff later on. And you don't really need to pull or anything. You don't want any torquing. And then I like to use an awl, and so I pull the awl just past that stitch line. And you're kind of pivoting here, same thing as before. But I'm going to show you ways to correct that if it gets a little bit off pivot point wise from top to bottom, from the one side to the other side. All right, so continue down. Don't sweat this too much, just do your best, because there's one other thing that's probably going to help it look more polished. All right, so let's cut this extra off there. All right, so this is the right side of our sleeve, and we have this little arch here. And now we're going to put the binding to the inside. Just put it right sides together, the sleeve, and fold it. And what I like to do, so if I notice that it's kind of pulling to one side, maybe I pivoted in a different spot than when I did on my first pass, I like to let the sleeve tell me where it wants to fold right here. If that means it gets a little misaligned down here, that's easier to correct than if we were to force this and pull it down, our sleeve might pull funny on the outside. So just let this lie the way it wants to. And now we're going to sew across this little folded tip here. And that just kind of encourages it to stay to the inside of the sleeve and stay folded right there. So we're just going to sew across a little triangle. You don't want any of this on the sleeve, just on this little bias spot. Trim your threads. All right. And now this is the outside. We still have some wrinkles there, but that's okay. And then we're going to fold this back on the larger side of the sleeve. And when I do this, I don't fold it back really crisply. I kind of relax, let it fold so that the sleeve is covering up the binding a little bit. So basically this fold edge of the binding is just underneath the fold edge of the sleeve. And we're going to sew across there and secure it. And now let's pleat up our sleeve bottom here. So fold your notches. So you have 4. You have these 2 right here. That's really deep. And then these 2 right here. So you have 2 and 2. All right, so just fold that over. And you want to sew just inside the seam line. And now get your next one ready. And make sure that where you're folding this pleat, this little tuck, is actually folding on the seam line as well. You don't want to get too skimpy. All right, I'm just going to trim this little thread so it doesn't kind of bug me later on. All right, now you're going to do, set in your sleeve if you like, and do your underarm seam the way you're planning on doing it. If you're doing a flat filled or French seam, overlocking, whatever. I'm just going to sew mine right sides together. Personally, I like finishing the entire sleeve as one whole thing and then attaching it to the shirt. It's a lot less fussy to deal with the sleeve and the cuff when it's just this one little unit, and I always prefer to have my sleeve assembled and then set it into the armhole rather than doing the underarm seam all at once. I think it looks a lot better. So, all right, so now we have this little, hem with the binding, or the sleeve opening with the binding on it, and we're ready to put on our cuff. So the way I like to put on my cuff is I start from the inside of the sleeve and go to the outside of the sleeve. So we're going to sew on the edge that's not interfaced first. And I'm going to turn the sleeve right side out I'm going to take this edge that doesn't have the interfacing, this long edge, and I'm going to line it up just past the sleeve, the seam allowance of the cuff, and I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And so the other thing you can do if you like to see all of your sleeve is turn it inside out and do the same thing. As long as you're doing the wrong side of the sleeve to your cuff, it'll be easier. So we'll do it like that. And the reason I do this is I don't have a free arm on my machine. If you have a free arm, you don't have to sew it from the inside of the sleeve like this. But you want your right side facing the wrong side of the sleeve, and you want it to be this uninterfaced edge, so it's the inside of the cuff. All right, we're going to line it up at that 1/2 inch seam line or wherever your seam allowance is, and you're just going to sew it on. Now try and be really nice and tidy with this back stitch at the beginning and the end. It really helps later on when we do our very last stitch that's kind of tidy. That way the threads aren't trying to sneak out and get exposed. All right, so let's sew. Make sure you encase that pleat line. And now remember, my cuff is much bigger than my sleeve. I don't know what it is about this pattern, but it always happens for me. There we go. And now I'm going to trim off the excess. That's a 1/2 inch pass, so it's about 1 inch for me. And we'll just trim this off. All right, so we've trimmed our sleeve, and now we're going to fold the cuff so that we're going to put it right sides together. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this and a lot of philosophies on what is the lesser evil to deal with when you're finishing your cuff. This is currently my favorite way, and the way I feel like I get the most success right off the bat. All right, so what I like to do is, I fold it right sides together, and I want the edge that I've already sewn to be folded up, but this to be hanging down. And now I'm going to sew a seam along this short edge, and try and make sure that you're getting this nice and parallel to your raw edge so that you get a nice squared off corner up here. You don't want to slightly go in a little bit or out a little bit. It really shows on a cuff. So, and then you want to go right next to where you've sewn your sleeve to the cuff. So just sew right to the next to it. All right, so there we go. Now trim these threads, because they really will come back to haunt you. You can clip your corner if you like, but a lot of times I don't. I like to make sure everything's going to be okay before I clip this corner, because if you need to go this way with your seam, you've just lost that opportunity if it needs to go out. So just remember that. So the other thing you need to be thinking about is if your cuff's going to match when it meets the other side right now. So we're going to check that by putting this cuff up to itself, and I just try and line up what's already been sewn. So right here, we're going to line up these two edges first, and try and be really exact, get right on top of itself, and then fold it up here at the same point. And even if the little bit extra hangs down past, like this one's hanging down lower than this one, that's okay. We know everything else is lined up. All right, we got it. And now we're going to secure this, and same thing, you want a nice parallel line, and I like to pull this, make sure it's all nice and perpendicular to this edge here. I think at this point what's more important, so say you are supposed to be using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, but you only have a 1/2 inch right here, do it a 1/2 inch here. Don't do 5/8 on this end and 1/2 inch here, or even if it's down to a 1/4 of an inch, because I know that happens sometimes. The pleats, you know, if you get 1/8 of an inch off on one pleat and 1/8 of an inch off on your placket, you already lost a 1/4 of an inch, right? So that's okay. You still have your cuff's going to be fine. So just make sure that you're keeping this line nice and parallel here. All right, so I'm gonna do a better back stitch there. It's hard. I don't like putting back stitches right on that fold there, because then sometimes it kind of pulls it in. All right, so I'm going to clip my corner there. And now we're going to turn our cuff right side out. Get these corners nice and crisp. And so look, our raw edge is on the right side of our sleeve, and that's okay. That's what we want. All right, and so the reason I like doing this, how I had you turn one end up and leave this one loose, is this is my little trick that I like to do. It's not a mystery. I didn't invent this. I mean, I discovered it, but I'm sure there's plenty of people who do it this way. So you could fold this under just by going, you know, like this onto itself, right? And then folding it over. But then look what happens. You have this other piece that kind of gets in the way and is exposed, right? So what I like to do is fold this placket side, or this cuff side, around the cuff I've already sewed. Now don't snug it up. Just do it like a little bit relaxed. Let it hang down a little bit extra. Remember, we're on the right side of our garment now. And if you really snug it up, what'll happen is it gets above the seam line and you're going to have trouble covering up this stitching. So we just want it to hang down a tiny little bit. And now we're going to put a few pins in. And the other thing to think about is try to get this edge, you know, really nice and crisp on top of itself. Iron it if you need to. And don't pull on this layer as opposed to, you know, this one's already fixed, right? So don't pull on this one this way. That way you'll end up getting a little bit of torquing. All right, and so I do this one and then I go over here and I do this one. And it's the same thing. I open it up and I fold this around that seam allowance, but kind of loosely. Not too tight. All right, so I'm just gonna put in a pin there. And now the other thing I'm gonna do is kind of pull my cuff so that it's folding between those 2 points. Find that spot. And what I like to do is I like to pin along this edge right here. The reason I do this is that this way I make sure that I don't over rotate the cuff when I'm pulling along this edge to turn it under. And so I won't get this effect where maybe I make it narrower here than it is over here. This is where it wanted to fold, so I leave it like that and I kind of fix that. And now I feel a little more secure when I'm pulling on this and folding it under. I kind of put one in the middle, nice and flat. And I'm going to fold it just past that stitch line. So I kind of always break up my pinning into quarters. So, you know, I did these 2 ends, and then I do this edge, and then I do the middle, and then I kind of go back and fill in the gaps. So I want that folded edge to go just past this. And you want to make sure like this edge feels a little bit longer than the cuff seam. So let's see if there's any way I can kind of rectify that now. Especially because if this edge is a little longer than the other one that's going to be sewn to, and it probably isn't, it's just kind of an illusion because we've already put a seam on this edge and so it's tighter, it's all bound, right? And so this edge isn't. So what you don't want is that when you're sewing with your machine, you don't want your machine to push all this extra fabric like this and you spill over the edge of your cuff. So we're kind of setting ourselves up to succeed. So I like to pull this excess and get it eased in there now. All right, let's put a pin in here. I can now borrow this pin here. All right, now we're ready to stitch. And when I stitch things like that, I never, ever, ever, if I can help it, start at the ends. I always start, like if it's a collar stand, I start at the center back neck. And on here, I'm going to start at the underarm. Because remember, this seam right here, this is the underarm. So essentially, that's the part we're not going to see the most, right? So I'm going to start there and put my back stitch there. I'm not even going to back stitch when I start. I'm just going to start sewing, and then we'll backstitch at the end. All right. Got our fold here. Stripes can be helpful and also you're kind of your worst enemy when you do things like this because they really show your errors, but then they can also be kind of helpful if you've cut everything out really nicely. Now if you were attaching your cuff and you're not actually going to top stitch these 3 edges, then you probably are going to want to start and stop at those end points. But if you can avoid it, I recommend it. It looks so much cleaner when the stitching is just continuous right there and there's no back stitch. And the reason I started doing this was when I would make a lot of mistakes with things like this or collar stands or something like that, my least favorite thing was to remove the back stitch right here, especially on a collar stand. It's front and center and something you look at. And maybe nobody's getting that close to you to see that, but you know. And I think anytime you're removing stitches right there, if it's kind of fragile fabric, you might get a little hole or it just might get tired looking. And so this way you don't worry about that. All right, so we're done. This looks really good. I mean, apart from the crazy color combination. All right, so there we go. And so now you're not really worried about where, oh, look at that, nice little piece of raw fabric. You're not really worried about where you landed on the cuff because we did it all on the outside and no one's gonna see the inside. Maybe if you roll up your cuff, yes, but it's just not as critical and it'll definitely be caught in there and clean finished. It won't look as bad as if you were doing it the other way and you didn't catch it at all. All right, let's get rid of this right here. All right. And so now you're ready to put your buttonhole in. And remember, your buttonhole goes parallel to the cuff so that it can kind of expand and contract as you're wearing it. And it goes front over back. So your buttonhole goes on your front and your button goes on the back, the under part. There we go. That looks really nice. Well, how did it go? I bet it turned out really good and it wasn't that bad, right? All right, well, if you found this helpful, please let me know, and please like, comment, and subscribe, and happy sewing. See you next time.